But today I want to talk about the urgent need for nuclear disarmament. More than half a century after the NPT was signed and came into force, the world finds itself still on the edge of the nuclear precipice, even though authoritative roadmaps exist to walk us back from the nuclear cliff to relative safety. I've given you a double-sided sheet of paper. The first table on that is from this book. It looks like a book, reads like a book. We call it a report. We published this in March. The entire PDF is available for free for download. If you go to the ANU website and look for my center, you can get the full report. I was going to say it is still the most up-to-date as well as authoritative, comprehensive and rigorous. But they just published this year's Disarmament Yearbook by SIPRI in Stockholm. So it's no longer the most up-to-date. But we hired SIPRI as a consultant, and the data anticipates a lot of the data they have in their book. The table 1 is directly from that. Let me just talk about that for a moment and then I'll explain the figures. You'll see from that there are still approximately 18,000 nuclear warheads in the arsenals of the 9 nuclear armed states. That's the 5 original, plus Israel, India, Pakistan and North Korea. The lowest number being North Korea. Now I'm not going to talk a lot about North Korea, not the least because that was the subject of the 2 articles I had in the Canberra Times a week or so ago, and I'm happy to deal with that in Q&A time. Of these 18,000, around 2,000 are on high launch alert status, where they can be launched within half an hour of information coming in by Americans or Russians that the other side has attacked them. And there's all sorts of dangers associated with that. The other 4 figures I have in there for you, they're not in the report, but they are drawn from the data in the report. The appendix in this is a compilation of a total of 213 agreed action plans and outcomes from the last NPT review conference 3 years ago, plus the recommendations from the International Commission for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the ICNND, which is co-chaired by Gareth Evans and Yoriko Kawaguchi, because it was a joint Australian-Japanese initiative. So we've taken those and measured state performance against these. And this is the first time something like this has been done. So countries that have agreed to do this or have been encouraged to do this by a commission as well, how are they bearing up? How do they comply with these sorts of agreed outcomes and recommendations? Should we not monitor their compliance and not just look at others? And there's approximately 70 odd from the NPT, another 60 odd from the 2 nuclear security summits, which is also intergovernmental, and then again 70 odd from the ICNND. And then you get to the 213. And if you look at figure 1 in that on the first page, you'll see that there's virtually no progress on nuclear disarmament, little on nuclear proliferation, some on nuclear security, and some on peaceful uses. And you can look at the other figures again, which tell the same story in different ways. But the basic point to grasp is, with the election of Barack Obama as president, who as candidate had pushed for the nuclear disarmament agenda and nuclear arms control agenda, who as president gives an exhilarating speech in Prague in April 2009, where he looks forward to a world freed of the threat of nuclear weapons. And that is followed by the report of the International Commission in November-December 2009. And then we have a successful NPT review conference in 2010. We forget, even though it was modestly successful, that the previous one was a complete failure in 2005. And the NPT review conference failure was followed by the failure of the World Summit at the United Nations in October 2005 to mention nuclear arms control disarmament at all, because they couldn't agree. So the NPT review conference is a modest success. New START proceeds and is brought into force. Obama goes to the United Nations in fall 2009 and presides over a Security Council debate and adoption of a resolution, which also repeats the ambition and hope and vision of a world freed of the threat of nuclear weapons. So there's that sense of excitement and hope and optimism rekindled after, from a multilateralist point of view, the dark years of the Bush administration in Washington. But in fact, since then, there's been very little substantial progress. There's been some progress, yes. New START was ratified, is in force. But New START is essentially about deployment of warheads, not cutting back on arsenals. Launch Alert, the 2000 remain there. There's little hope of progress on this front for all sorts of reasons and disputes, including missile defense systems, including conventional military imbalances, including existing conflicts. The CTBT is still not entered into force, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty is still not negotiated. Conference on Disarmament remains deadlocked. Deadlocked to the point where for more than a decade, they haven't even been able to agree on an annual agenda. 18,000 weapons since 1968-1970, when the NPT is signed, comes into force, and the 5 nuclear weapon states sign on to the legal obligation to engage in good faith negotiations to dismantle their nuclear weapon stockpiles completely. An obligation that is strengthened in 1996 by the World Court Advisory Opinion, which says that obligation is not just to engage in, but to bring to an early conclusion the good faith negotiations on nuclear abolition. In the meantime, in our region, nuclear arsenals actually growing in the case of China, India, and Pakistan. So the new CIPRI report says that over the past 12 months, these 3 countries have increased their nuclear arsenals by about 10 weapons each. I remember going to a talk by Bruce Riddell, who's a former senior CIA official and still acts as an advisor to the president on these matters, saying that Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world and the biggest number of terrorists per square mile. You put two together, it's not a comforting equation. So we are still, as I said, on that edge of a nuclear precipice. Now, nuclear weapons are uniquely destructive and therefore uniquely threatening to all our security. The near universalization of the access to nuclear technology, skills, and materials risks bringing about a remarkable democratization of the weapons and means of total destruction. There is therefore a compelling need to challenge and overcome the reigning complacency on the nuclear risks and dangers, to sensitize policy communities to the urgency and gravity of the nuclear threats and the availability of non-nuclear alternatives as anchors of national and international security orders. The great anti-nuclear movements of the 1980s need to be reinvigorated by exploiting modern social media tools. But to convert movements into coalitions of change requires a shift from the politics of street protests to the politics of engagement with policy and with politics. Let me repeat, a nuclear catastrophe could destroy us anytime. Although if our luck holds, it could be delayed for another 6 decades. The uncomfortable reality is that the nuclear peace has held owing as much to good luck as to sound stewardship. But because we have learned to live with nuclear weapons for 67 years, we've become desensitized to the gravity and the immediacy of the threat. This tyranny of complacency could yet exact a fearful price if we sleepwalk our way into a nuclear Armageddon. So it really is long past time to lift the shroud of the mushroom cloud from the international body politic. Now, of course, nuclear weapons are strategic equalizers for weaker sides in conflict relationships. But they do not buy defense on the cheap. In fact, later this month, my center will be publishing a policy paper, discussion paper, on the opportunity costs of nuclear weapons, both for developing countries and for developed countries, in terms of what else can be done. They can lead to the creation of a national security state with a premium on governmental secretiveness, reduced public accountability, and increased distance between citizens and governments. There is the added risk of proliferation to extremist elements through leakage, theft, state collapse, and state capture. In terms of opportunity costs, heavy military expenditure, particularly on nuclear weapons, amounts to stealing from the poor. Nuclear weapons do not help to combat today's real threats of insurgency, terrorism, poverty, illiteracy, malnutrition, and corruption. As they said in the streets of Delhi in 1998, when India conducted its nuclear tests, no food, no clothing, no shelter, no worry, we have the bomb. Think about it. They haven't been used since 1945. Which begs the question, what use are they? They are going to cost us in today's dollars, for these 9 countries, $1 trillion over the next decade for weapons that we don't use. Could that money not be put to more productive use in each one of these 9 countries? The NPT has kept the nuclear nightmare at bay for over 4 decades. The number of countries with nuclear weapons is still in single figures, 9, just in single figures. There's been substantial progress in reducing the numbers of nuclear warheads. We've come down from 70,000 odd in the 80s to under 20,000 today. But the threat is still acute, with a combined stockpile of almost 18,000 nuclear weapons, of which, as I said, 2,000 are in a state of high operational alert. Let me remind you that the NPT enshrined a 3-way bargain between nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. All 3 bargains are under strain as we confront a 5-fold challenge. First, the 5 NPT nuclear powers, that's Britain, China, France, Russia, and the US, have disregarded the Article 6 NPT obligations to disarm. Second, 3 nuclear-armed states, and now 4, lie outside the NPT: India, Israel, Pakistan. Third, as an intergovernmental agreement, the NPT does not cover non-state groups. including terrorists. Fourth, some NPT members may be trying to cheat on their non-proliferation obligations, while North Korea has withdrawn from the NPT and tested nuclear weapons 3 times in 2006, 2009, and February this year. And fifth, and finally, many countries are interested in nuclear energy owing to rising environmental anxieties, rising fossil fuel price, raising issues of safety, security, and possible weaponization. The disquieting trend of a widening circle of NPT illicit and extra NPT nuclear armed states has a self-generating effect in drawing other countries into the game of nuclear brinksmanship. So the choice is not between the status quo of 9 nuclear armed states, but you go back and start rolling back from 9 to 0, or you accept the reality of more countries getting that, and I'll come back to that. Adding to the 5 sets of concerns is the sorry state of the global governance mechanisms. The Conference on Disarmament, as I said, as the world's only standing multilateral disarmament machinery, cannot even agree on an agenda. I've been a UN official, but in my darker days I used to think that the United Nations exists so that nations who are unable to do anything individually can get together to decide that nothing can be done collectively. The CTBT has not yet entered into force, FMCT not yet negotiated. As I said, after more than a decade in the doldrums, the nuclear agenda was re-energized by a coalition of 4 US national security policy heavyweights: Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, George Shultz, William Perry. In an article first published in the Wall Street Journal in 2007, and they've had 4 or 5 since then, including one a month or 2 ago. And then it was given fresh momentum with President Barack Obama's Prague Promise in 2009. I've talked about the RCNND report and the nuclear security summits. But I also said that there is a palpable and growing sense that New START might mark the end of nuclear accomplishments instead of being the first step on the road to nuclear abolition. There is little evidence of significant domestic political constituencies in the nuclear armed states for disarmament. Tellingly, not one country that had the bomb in 1968 when the NPT was signed has given them up. Judging by their actions rather than rhetoric, all 9 are determined to remain nuclear armed. All of them are modernizing nuclear forces and refining nuclear doctrines. For example, Washington will retain a cache of reserved warheads even after implementing START 2 as a strategic hedge available for rapid uploading should the need arise. And the US is also building 3 new factories for increased nuclear warhead production capacity should they decide to do so. To would-be proliferators, if you look at the existing arsenals, the doctrines of use, the deployment practices, the stated justifications, the reluctance to engage in all sorts of activities, the nuclear armed states boycotted the Humanitarian Dimensions Conference held in Oslo in March, and they wouldn't join in the statement in Geneva a couple of months ago. Rather, to my embarrassment, Australia would not sign on to that statement on humanitarian aspects of the nuclear thing either. But if you look at all these, it is clear that all 9 countries foresee a continued use and role of nuclear weapons in their national security strategy indefinitely into the future. And that means that for others, the lesson is inescapable. Nuclear weapons are indispensable in today's world and for dealing with tomorrow's threats. So how do you convince others of the futility of nuclear weapons when your deeds and practices and words demonstrate utility for them, for national security. Reflecting the technical state of 68 when the NPT was signed, Iran insists on its right to pursue the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes to the point where it would be a screwdriver away from the bomb. So if you look at what Iran has done and what it wants to do, it is not in fact in violation of the NPT as per the 1968 treaty. But we know if we allow them to do that, they will go down the same route as North Korea. Because having got to that stage, they can then pull out and get the bomb. So we want to impose tougher conditions than what they signed on to. But on our side, we don't want to implement even the more relaxed provisions and obligations of the NPT there. So we don't know how to stop Iran from jumping out of the NPT box, let alone how to make North Korea jump back into the NPT box. Japan is the emotional touchstone in this discourse as the world's only victim of the use of the bomb. The United States has a special responsibility to light the way to nuclear abolition, both as the only country to have used them and as the world's biggest military power. The bomb was developed during the Second World War by a group of scientists brought together in the Manhattan Project under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer. Witnessing the first test, the first successful atomic test in July 1945, Oppenheimer recalled, interestingly enough for me, the sacred Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, quote, and he quoted it, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One," unquote. Birth and death are symbiotically linked in the cycle of life. And so Oppenheimer recalled also the matching verse from the Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," unquote. The citizens of Hiroshima, in rebuilding their city, have consecrated it as a testimonial to social resilience, human solidarity, and nuclear abolition. Once again, a beautiful, scenic, and thriving city, Hiroshima lives by three codes: transformation from a military city to a city of peace, to forgive and atone, but never to forget, and never again. The case for abolition, ladies and gentlemen, is simple, elegant, and eloquent. Without strengthening national security, because they are unusable, nuclear weapons diminish our common humanity and the doctrines underpinning them, which rely on killing hundreds of thousands and millions of civilians, impoverish our soul. Their very destructiveness robs them of military utility against other nuclear powers, because it would be a mutual suicide pact, any nuclear exchange. But it also robs them of political utility against non-nuclear countries, because the political costs of breaking the taboo would vastly exceed any battlefield gains from their use against non-nuclear countries. As long as any one country has them, others will want some. As long as they exist, they will be used one day again by design, accident, miscalculation, or through unauthorized use. Our goal, therefore, should be to make the transition from a world in which the role of nuclear weapons is seen as central to maintaining security, to a world where they become progressively marginal and eventually entirely unnecessary. Now, of course, like chemical and biological weapons, they cannot be disinvented. But like them, nuclear weapons too can be controlled, regulated, restricted, and outlawed under an international regime that ensures strict compliance through effective and credible inspection, verification, and enforcement. And therefore, a forward-looking agenda, a common task is, or should be, to delegitimize the possession, deployment, and use of nuclear weapons, to require no first use and sole purpose commitments. By the way, I'm not sure how many of you have read our latest defense white paper. There is a very interesting and unremarked shift. We now say that we depend upon extended deterrence, the nuclear weapons of the United States, solely for defense against attack by nuclear weapons. This is the first time we've said that. One of these days I might get around to actually publicizing that. Because it's an interesting shift, and it's very rare amongst the allies to make that point, that we don't want to depend on nuclear weapons for attack from categories other than nuclear weapons. So it's given how every word in these reports is very finely vetted, it's not a coincidental or accidental slip of the pen. To reduce their numbers by 2025 to 10% of present stockpiles. We've seen enough calculations that the United States could cut its arsenal down to 500 weapons without any adverse effect for its own security or for its role as the guarantor of extended deterrence for allies. Because unlike fixed regiments of defense forces, nuclear weapons can cover the whole world against all threats. We need to reduce the high-risk reliance on them by introducing further degrees of separation between possession, deployment, and use, by physically separating warheads from delivery systems and lengthening the decision-making fuse for the launch of nuclear weapons. We need to strengthen the AIIA's authority and capacity, to establish a multilateral, multinational fuel cycle, and to toughen up supply-side restrictions. The biggest stimulus to nuclear weapons proliferation is their continued possession by the 9 states. One of the great ironies of the nuclear age is that those who worship the most devoutly at the altar of nuclear weapons issue the fiercest fatwas against anyone else wanting to join them at that altar. But the threat to use nuclear weapons, both to deter their use by others and also to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation, legitimizes their possession, deployment, and use. If you, as a virtuous, indispensable, uniquely benevolent power, say in your doctrine and demonstrate that intent in your deployment practices, that you are prepared to use nuclear weapons under some contingencies, then of course you are legitimizing the possession, doctrines, and potential use of nuclear weapons. That which is legitimate cannot be stopped from proliferating. If nuclear weapons did not exist, they could not proliferate. Because they do exist, they will proliferate. So the very fact of their existence in the arsenals of 9 countries is sufficient guarantee of their proliferation to others, and someday again use. Conversely, nuclear disarmament is a necessary condition of nuclear non-proliferation. Hence that one of the titles. If you really want nuclear non-proliferation, prepare for nuclear disarmament. But the NPT, for all practical purposes, has been subverted from a prohibition regime into a purely non-proliferation regime. So maybe we should look beyond it to a cleaner alternative that gathers all the meritorious elements of the NPT into one workable package in a nuclear weapons convention. This will not self-materialized simply because we wish it so. Nor will it ever eventuate if we always defer it to the long term. We'll get around to it tomorrow maybe. That tomorrow is not going to come. There are many technical, legal, and political challenges to be overcome. But serious preparatory work on it needs to be started now with conviction and with commitment. And this requires us to build on, and if necessary around, the NPT in order to have a nuclear-free world based on a universal, binding, and verifiable nuclear weapons convention. So we must begin the transition. We must begin to prepare for a transition to a world that will construct all our common security free of the existence and threat of nuclear weapons. But without, and that's where the challenge comes, without in the meantime jeopardizing the stability of the existing nuclear order centered on the NPT, which for all its inbuilt inequities has proven remarkably robust for more than 6 decades. And this means we have to take care in avoiding 2 unfortunate outcomes in a precipitate rush to nuclear disarmament. First, in getting rid of nuclear weapons, we have to make sure that we don't tip the world into a situation where countries believe they can return to massively destructive conventional wars like the 2 world wars. So in our quest for a world free of nuclear weapons, we must not fall back into a world safe again for major power wars, which we haven't had since 1945. Second, we have to make sure that those non-nuclear states, including Australia, who shelter under the nuclear umbrella of others, do not feel so threatened by a nuclear-free world that they decide to get their own bombs. That would certainly be a worry that I would have, for example, about Japan, if we rush into a nuclear-free world. So we've got to take care of that. There are genuine concerns and legitimate fears. Nonetheless, critics of the zero option want to keep their bombs but deny them to others. And that's where the problems come back. Because I think those who dismiss the likes of me as naive idealists and hopeless optimists who don't know the real world, I think such critics lack the intellectual honesty and courage to show how can non-proliferation be enforced without disarmament, to acknowledge that the price of keeping nuclear arsenals is uncontrolled proliferation, and to argue why a world of uncontrolled proliferation is better for national and international security than abolition. So if they're prepared to engage me on that and show me this, I'm prepared to listen. But in the meantime, I repeat, the focus on non-proliferation to the neglect of disarmament ensures that we get neither. If we want non-proliferation, we must prepare for disarmament. Within our lifetime, either we will achieve nuclear abolition, or we will have to live with nuclear proliferation and die with the use of nuclear weapons. It seems to me better the soft glow of satisfaction from the noble goal realized of nuclear weapons banned than the harsh glare on the morning after these weapons having been used again. Thank you.